Having waited for years to learn more about the intriguing plot of Final Fantasy XVI, we are now in the enviable position of being able to sift through everything with a fine-tooth comb, and we're better to focus than with the game's ending. Throughout its ever-expanding plot, Final Fantasy XVI touched on quite a few thematic elements, and there were numerous poignant messages, but perhaps the most impressive element was that the overarching narrative was able to shine the spotlight on an expansive cast of characters without ever losing focus. To ensure such positive results were achieved, the team of talented writers who worked on Final Fantasy XVI deserve a huge amount of credit. But the mastermind behind it all was Kazutoyo Maehiro, an experienced game designer who learnt his craft from the now legendary video game creator Yasumi Matsuno. Matsuno shot to prominence throughout the 90s due to his ability to tell compelling stories that had a grounded feel, and weave those stories into gameplay that was equally as compelling. The characters he created had complex interpersonal relationships, and at their core, Matsuno's stories were as much about the conflicts that existed between humans that were driven by emotions, as they were about the conflicts that involved supernatural and more mystical elements. Due to having worked in such close vicinity to Matsuno on Tactics, Tactics Advanced, Vagrant Story, and Final Fantasy XII, Maehiro was considered one of Matsuno's most ardent disciples. And in the build-up, Naoki Yoshida, the producer of Final Fantasy XVI, told us that because of the close relationship they had, it shouldn't be too surprising to see sources of inspiration scattered throughout Final Fantasy XVI. That then relates to the contents of this video. But before we delve into how some of those inspirations manifested, we should point out, even if it was perhaps already clear by the title of this video, that we are about to go into deep spoiler territory. So please, treat this as your spoiler warning. Come back later once you've finished the game if you haven't done so already. Alright, with that out of the way, let's start delving into some of the most important elements that featured within the ending sequence. And perhaps the best place to start is with unravelling the story and role of Clive Rosfield. At the beginning of the game, Clive Rosfield was hellbent on seeking revenge for the perceived death of his brother, Joshua. For over a decade, this fueled Clive. But when, by chance, he encountered Jill at the Nysa Defile, things changed. Clive was still desperate for revenge, but he was no longer alone. And as he sought to understand the truth about what happened at Phoenix Gate, Jill was there to provide support. Clive would then learn that the person he had been seeking revenge against this whole time was none other than himself. And after learning that truth and realising his quest for revenge was no longer relevant, Clive's path was changed. He therefore decided to align himself with the ideals of Cid. Cid believed that the Mother Crystals were responsible for the majority of Valisthea's problems. They had made the denizens lazy, so reliant on magic that they were unable to perform even the most basic of tasks. Cid also believed that the Mother Crystals had hastened the spreading of the Blight, as to fuel the ever-increasing use of magic, they were sucking more and more ether from the very fabric of the land. Cid's solution was to destroy the Mother Crystals, and their first target was Drake's head. This Mother Crystal was controlled by the Holy Empire of Sanbreque, and the mission should have been simple. However, upon shattering the Mother Crystal, Clive was made aware that even larger threats loomed on the horizon, and perhaps the biggest of those threats was something called Ultima. And it was here that we learned that Ultima did not see Clive as Clive. It saw Clive as Muthos, a vessel that had been created by the gods for the sole purpose of wielding unimaginable power. Ultima had hoped to be able to control this vessel, and his efforts had been working, but thanks to interventions from Cid and Joshua, the latter of which chose to sacrifice his health so that the influence of Ultima might be contained, Clive was able to leave Sanbreque relatively unscathed. The segment was very revealing though, and it was also an interesting throwback. Ultima was the final boss of Final Fantasy Tactics, and much of that narrative revolved around the resurrection of Ultima and its need for a suitable host. In the aftermath, Clive decided to honour Cid and continue walking the path that had been laid out for him. This meant destroying Drake's breath, Drake's fang, and Drake's tail before finishing off with Drake's spine. But as this quest continued, the path Clive followed had begun to change. Even though Ultima was largely contained, its agents were everywhere. They sought to conspire against Clive, and with every new mention of the name Euthos, Clive began to realise that perhaps much of what was transpiring had been ordained. And if that were true, then the real conflict was not about mother crystals, dominance, or icons, it was about fate, that of his own, and the rest of Valisthea. In this regard, everything revolved around the notion of breaking a person's individual will. This concept, of course, had strong narrative connotations, but it was also baked into the gameplay loop of Final Fantasy XVI. Every major enemy would have an associated will gauge, and the description highlighted that when this gauge was depleted, the subject would be defenseless, unable to fight back. But in the wider context, they would also be unable to resist. Relating back to the narrative, this was what Ultima had planned for Clive. Every major event that had happened throughout Clive's life was meant to break him, to break his will. From not being chosen as the dominant of Phoenix through to the supposed death of his brother and subsequent enslavement, Ultima had hoped that these events would traumatize Clive so much that his will to live would dissipate. But instead, something Ultima had not foreseen happened. Clive was not broken. These events galvanized him. They strengthened his will and built up a resistance against Ultima. And even in those moments where his resolve faltered, Joshua was there to bring him back from the brink. This confused and frustrated Ultima. It had not anticipated Clive's resolve, nor had it anticipated the meddling of Joshua. Nonetheless, as the game reached its conclusion, Clive would still end up obtaining the power of Ultima, and in doing so, he would become the perfect vessel that Ultima had always anticipated. But instead of becoming Muthos, an entity who would shape events using godlike powers to bend others to its will, Clive worked against Ultima's plans to become Logos, an entity who was governed by traits associated with humanity. It's unclear whether this affected how Ultima's power manifested within Clive, but upon absorbing the power, Clive realised it was too much for his body. Up until this point, Clive had essentially been immune to the fate of the dominants and the fates of bearers. Whereas they had limits, with each use of their powers taking a physical toll, Clive would suffer no degradation irrespective of how far he pushed. That changed upon absorbing Ultima's power. Clive immediately realised that his body could not withstand the effects of such power, and perhaps this was always the plan, that Ultima would use the vessel and discard it after its purpose had been fulfilled. As such, Clive made a choice. Instead of casting the spell that Ultima intended, which would have seen the slumbering gods transported to a new land, he chose to try and resurrect Joshua and destroy Origin. And in doing so, he would not only kill those slumbering gods, but he would rid Valisthea of all magic in the process and place fate back in their own hands. This meant there would no longer be any icons, any dominants, or any bearers, and the dream that Sid held would finally be realised. In the aftermath, Clive was spent. Mustering up enough power to destroy Origin had placed too much strain on his body, and it started to degrade. The initial signs of degradation could be seen within Clive's fingertips, but after he attempted to use the powers of the Phoenix, perhaps as a fond reminder of the connection he once held with his brother, his whole hand became petrified. Resigned to his fate, Clive slumped back on the beach and gazed upon the moon and Metia, muttering the words, "Can you see it too, Jill?" It was at this point that we are led to believe that Clive has died, and focus therefore shifts back to the hideaway. In the initial sense, there's jubilation following the birth of Edda's child. Gav, in particular, is over the moon, owing to the bond he built with Edda on their journey back from the Ash continent, and he vowed to act as a surrogate father to her unborn child, with or without her blessing. Mid and Jill were also there to share in the excitement, but jubilation quickly turned to mourning. Seeing that Torgal was gazing upon the moon, Jill joined their stalwart companion. Gazing on the moon and Metia was a pastime Jill and Clive often shared when they were younger, and it's something they did on the eve of the Phoenix Gate catastrophe. Each time, Jill would pray to Metia for Clive's safe return, something that would be signified by the breaking of a new dawn. Every time Jill had made this prayer, Clive returned, but this time Jill saw the light of Metia fade. It's unclear what this meant, but one interpretation is that Jill took this as her wish not being granted. Clive had succeeded, but he was not coming back. Ever attuned to his surroundings, Gav saw Jill's reaction. Taking this as Clive having succeeded, Gav said to Edda's newborn child, "The world is yours now, yours to do with as you please." Valisthea would no longer be a slave to magic. But even though this outcome was cause for celebration, it had come at the cost of their dear friend, partner, and leader. Distraught, Jill ran from the room with Torgal, but as she looked out to the sea, there was a glimmer of hope. Dawn came all the same, ushering in a new era, and with it came the hope that Clive had indeed survived. After the credits rolled, we then saw this new era. Children were playing, and it's emphasised that they were no longer using magic to perform basic actions such as starting a fire. It's unclear how much time has passed between the destruction of Origin and these events, but it's implied to have been quite long, as elements such as icons and magic have been relegated to fairy tales and historic texts. One such piece is called War of the Icons. It's said to contain the likes of Ifrit and Bahamut, and it's rather fitting that such a harrowing and traumatic time within the history of Valisthea has now formed the basis for common child's play. This imagination has been stoked by a book. As shown by the subtitles, this book was called Final Fantasy, and its author was none other than Joshua Rossfield. Now, this could mean numerous things. On the one hand, it suggests that Clive was able to revive Joshua before Origin was destroyed, and that he wrote the book. Another scenario is that Joshua did not survive, but wrote the book before they left for Origin, bequeathing its contents to Yote or another member of the Undying, or even perhaps Harpocrates. One final option is that Joshua neither survived nor wrote the book, and it's actually Clive that wrote the story. It's perhaps nicer to assume that Joshua did indeed survive, however, and that after destroying Origin, Clive was able to somehow transport his brother to safety before collapsing himself on the beach. In a similar vein, it's also unclear as to the fate of Dion Lesage. Again, it's implied that Dion perished following his noble sacrifice at the hands of Ultima Risen, but his body was not petrified, nor was there any sign of a fatal wound outside of a cut on his head. Lest we also forget that unlike Benedicta, Hugo, and Barnabas, Dion was not only able to survive and recover from the devastating defeat suffered at the hands of Clive, but further, Bahamut was ravaged by Ifrit Risen, as opposed to Ifrit. The final piece of evidence is that Dragoons do not suffer fall damage. Based on this, assumptions can be made either way, and it'll be fun to see how the fanbase sways in this regard, and whether there's a desire for Dion to return. There are also plenty of other questions that were not answered within the conclusion or indeed the wider story, but that sounds like a video for another day. With Final Fantasy XVI being such a lore and narrative-rich game, rife with symbolism and throwbacks to previous Final Fantasy entries, delving into the intricacies of the story is sure to keep fans and content creators alike occupied for some time to come. We'd love to hear though how you interpreted the contents of the ending sequence, so be sure to let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Elsa Claire Farron, Gelson D. Kajata, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Eye supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.